My name is Michael Guyot, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Is joining us here for the hour is General Robert Spalding, who's got an incredible career and background, which we'll get into. But General, for those who are not familiar with who you are, just introduce yourself to the audience as far as what you've done, what encouraged you to get into the military, and some of the things that you've done really since the Trump administration.
Yeah, thank you. I was living in California, getting an agricultural economics degree. My family farmed in the San Joaquin Valley there. I'd been born in San Jose, kind of spent my first few years in San Francisco, and then went out to live with my family there, and thought I was going to stay on the family farm. And this movie came out that was pretty exciting called Top Gun. If you haven't seen the second version of it, I highly recommend it. It's even better than the first. And that got me really fired up to fly jets. And I didn't go into the Navy, though, because the Navy, all the services were drawing down. So the Navy didn't take me, but the Air Force did. And, my intent was just to go fly airplanes for, one tour and then to come home to California. And along the way, I got this great opportunity to go to China. So at that time, I was flying the B-2 stealth bomber, and I got selected for a program called the Olmsted Scholar Program, where they send you to Defense Language Institute to learn a foreign language, and then you go overseas to study at a foreign university for 2 years. So I went and learned Chinese, and I went to Shanghai, China, and lived there from 2002 to 2004 and loved every minute of it. Wanted to go back to China after I left in 2004, and could, I had to go back to the Air Force. I had to give them 10 more years of my life because of the opportunity to live in China for 2 years. But then, when I left in 2004, I told my wife, "Hey, I want to come back and live and do business in China. It's such a dynamic, place, and the people are so friendly." And of course, the Air Force had to get their pound of flesh out of me. So I spent another, 10 years or so working my way through the B-2 community. Did just about every job you can do in the B-2 community, except for wing commander. I was a vice wing commander when I left in 2013, and went to the Council on Foreign Relations. And the reason I went to be a senior military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City was because the Air Force was grooming me to be the senior defense official in Beijing. That was unbeknownst to me. And I had been looked at because of my prior experience as going back to China and filling that role because I spoke Chinese and knew a lot about China. So I did that for a year, met a lot of really senior business people, financial people, venture people, you name it, in the business community, and also in kind of the international politics arena. So a lot of prime ministers and heads of state, because they all flow through the Council on Foreign Relations, especially when you have UNGA, UN General Assembly, once a year. And so they all come to the council and talk. And so you meet a lot of these people. And it was with this kind of new Rolodex I had that I went from there to work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So I worked for Chairman Dempsey, Marty Dempsey first, and then Chairman Dumford. So the first one was an Army general. The second one was a Marine Corps general. And when I got to the Pentagon in 2014, it was under the Obama administration, and we were focused on the South China Sea, the islands in the South China Sea, and what are we going to do about the islands in the South China Sea? And General Dempsey and General Dempsey basically said, "Hey, there's nothing we can do. I mean, we're not going to bomb them." So kind of he blew off the administration. And then General Dumford came in, and so the administration's asking him the same questions they were Dempsey. What do we do about these islands? And he's like, "Okay, well, what do we do? Well, what we can do is we can cut off the Chinese from having access to them, physical access to them. That's something you can do, but that's an act of war." And that was really the first time that the President Obama in this case, turned to somebody other than the Secretary of Defense, in this case, the Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of Commerce, and said, "Hey, what are we going to do about this?" And unfortunately, we didn't have enough sophistication in the government to understand that, American pension funds were funding the islands in the South China Sea. I didn't even know this at the time. And so it was under this backdrop that I got this presentation emailed to me while I was at the Pentagon. It was probably the fall of 2014, from somebody I'd met when I was in New York, detailing it had come from one of the top 5 audit firms, and it was detailing all of these companies that had been attacked by a Chinese actor and had been taken over, or at least attempted to be taken over. And immediately, I got the feeling of an air campaign. Like, and it looked, it sounded, it felt very much to me like the same air campaign that we had run, from Whiteman Air Force Base with the B-2 against the Serbian regime to end the Kosovar genocide. So we had gone after the elites of the country, their assets, and taken them away. And so when I looked through this presentation, I'm like, well, they're doing the same thing we were doing against Kosovo, or against Serbia, but they're not using weapons. They're using finance. They're using business practices. And sure enough, as we started to dig into this, and I started to brief the senior leadership of the military, I tried to figure out, like, who's doing anything about this in the federal government. And the answer was nobody was, primarily because nobody understood it was going on. And the reason nobody understood it was going on is because in our system, in our economic, social, political system, business doesn't talk to government. So if business has a problem, they don't want to go to government to get them to solve it. And so there was no communication going on. So government really wasn't aware. I went to the FBI, DOJ, State Department, U.S. Trade Representative, Commerce, Treasury. I went everywhere in the federal government, and nobody either knew this was going on. And if they knew it was going on, or when I presented the information, they're like, well, that's not really my job. The Pacific commander, PACOM commander, who has the responsibility for defending the Pacific, he uses weapons. He doesn't use finance and economics to protect the nation. So he's like, this is really bad, but unfortunately, it's not in my job jar. And so we started working because I was leading a team who were advising the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on China policy. We started working to create the capability to analyze and understand what was happening to our country. In the way we did that, the Joint Staff requested from the Air Force resources, money, and people to begin to study this problem of what is China doing to our economy. And so we started an office in the Air Force called the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis. And we started hiring PhD economists to start studying the implications of our relationship with China to initially our defense industrial base. And then it broadened and expanded to really understanding the implications across our economy. And this led me on this 3-year tour of understanding very deeply the implications of our relationship with China on the United States. I went from there to be the senior defense official in Beijing, and was really only there for 6 months. When I got there, within a week, the Chinese had taken the unmanned underwater vehicle, and they had taken it right in front of one of our destroyers. And so I was the one responsible for negotiating the return of that. And in that, I got to see, how the Chinese did command and control, with their frontline forces, all the way from Xi Jinping on down, understood kind of how they were doing things. And it was actually quite impressive. And then very shortly thereafter, after that episode was over, I was pulled into the White House to help architect the national security strategy. And what I brought with me to the White House was a 7-page strategy that I had written while I was in Beijing. And it really laid out what I thought what we needed to do. And essentially that strategy said we need to protect the country. And when I say protect, get the Chinese Communist Party out of our institutions, whether they're academic, political, social, economic, financial, or trade. They are essentially undermining all of these institutions, not just domestically, but internationally. World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, UN. Try to begin to block them out of having access to those institutions, because their goal is essentially to undermine them both domestically and internationally. So that's the protect. Rebuild. We hadn't been investing in the nation, in our people, for almost 30 years. So infrastructure, manufacturing, science and technology, and STEM education, we need to invest money in the country. And then inspire. And inspire really is something America had been doing for its almost 240 plus years of existence, in that creating freedom and economic opportunity for its citizens. Others would look at the United States as a great place to go. And what was happening, because China was in our institutions, in our corporate sector, in our financial sector, they were bleeding America in a way that the benefits, the economic opportunity that comes from living in a free society was not accruing to our own citizens. It was actually accruing to the 600 million or so, actually 300 million or so, that the Chinese pulled out of poverty. And so, as our innovation, technology, talent, and capital flowed into China, it was flowing out of America. And so we saw, for instance, our infrastructure today is a grade D. Our science and technology, we were investing 2% of gross domestic product. Now we're investing less than 0.7% of gross domestic product. So there was not this virtuous cycle of renewal, and we had destroyed the manufacturing base. So a lot of people that had been in manufacturing jobs, and I've been on the floor of a manufacturing facility that's been closed overnight because of predation from China, and these people are walking around shell shocked, just like the Germans were during the raids of 8th Air Force on Germany during World War II. They're shell shocked. Their jobs are gone. They'd been in these companies 20, 30 years. And that was happening in tens of thousands of communities all across the United States. And so, as you look at that and say, hey, we need to protect, rebuild, and inspire the rest of the world through providing for American citizens, that was really I think the idea behind the national security strategy. The only problem is, and that strategy still exists, by the way, and you can go look online and read it. The only problem is corporate America and Wall Street are preventing us from actually implementing it. So, I know it's a long answer to how the story started, but it kind of flows into everything that I've been working on since.
No, I love that, because there's a lot of directions I want to go with this. Okay, so this point about this kind of disconnect between business and government not talking to each other seems like an underestimated reason for why we're kind of in this situation, because businesses are going to want to go for efficiency and profit margins, and you can argue the government really needs to worry more about national security when it comes to resources. And I'm sharing at the top of the space here a tweet you put out a couple of days ago: when somebody else makes the things you need to live, do you control your own destiny? Where did the lines of communication stop, or were they ever really there in any kind of meaningful way, where the private sector is actually actively communicating and letting the public sector know that these kind of undercurrents are at play?
Well, so for example, if you look at your 10Qs and 10Ks that come out of companies, they don't want to report, for instance, that they've lost an asset in China because the Chinese Communist Party has taken it back from them. Right? They don't want to report that because it affects earnings. And so they just keep it on the books. And so there's a lot of things that they don't want to report because it affects the stock price. At the same time, I'll just give you an anecdote of one story that I heard from a company CEO, or actually a company board member. The CEO was added, and the company had just spent something like $400 million on buying the 49% of a company in China that they didn't own. And so they had owned 51% of this company. They bought the other 49%, and they were so excited because now they owned the company. They thought, wow, okay, we're an American company. We own this company in China. Now we can go after this market and dominate it. And within a month or two, the Chinese government came to them and said, you cannot do business because you're a wholly owned foreign company. And so they lost the entire investment. And so at this dinner at the White House with President Obama and President Xi, or Chairman Xi, the CEO asked Chairman Xi, hey, do you know that you guys took this company from me? And she goes, yes, I know. And I said, well, are you going to do anything about it? And he basically pointed to the president and he said, are you going to make me? Or do you think he is going to make me? That's what he said. Or do you think he is going to make me? And so, there's this undercurrent of things that are happening to American companies that affect their earnings, that affect the stock price, that they are not reporting. And there's repercussions if they report that to the government. If they get hacked, they could be investigated by the SEC. So they're generally, their general counsel says, if you have a problem like this, don't report it. And so there's this whole undercurrent of things that are happening that affect the valuation of the company that they don't want to report to the government because they're afraid that information will get out into the market and it'll affect the business. So it's built into our system that businesses want to obfuscate bad things that happen to them because it affects their valuation. And this is why the government was not aware of these things happening.
Although it's interesting, right? Because you can make the case that more and more of this is coming to light because of social media, whether it's various athletes that will say something that becomes questionable because there's some underlying money that's coming from China that's impacting whatever their sport or profession might be. But I want to go back to something you mentioned about your experience living in China. You said China is very dynamic. China is so dynamic. And I remember as COVID was starting to spread and things were, lockdowns were starting, you would see, at least on Twitter, these videos, these tweets coming out of China where literally they would build a whole hospital in like a week. That they were just able to kind of very quickly get infrastructure up because they thought there would be a severe pandemic coming. Here in the U.S., obviously, it's a lot more different. Now, I want you to talk about some of the things that you think China, from a government standpoint, maybe does better than the U.S., and how can the U.S. government maybe compete more on that? Because there's competition from a business perspective, but there's also a government competition that's going on.
Well, I mean, again, I go back to access to capital, talent, and technology are crucial to growing a nation. What China does very, very well is bring a whole of nation approach to gaining access to those things, capital, technology, and talent, for the benefit of China. So, they bring technology in, they bring talent in. That's how they learn how to create ICBMs, just using our own scientists. Hypersonics, they bring NASA scientists over to teach them. Capital, they get Wall Street to invest capital over there, and then they have a non-convertible currency and strict capital controls so that you can't get that capital out. So it's like a giant fish trap that sucks in all of this things. And if you think about it from a nation state perspective, if you say, hey, I've got a pension fund in America, and that pension fund is supposed to earn a return and essentially for the retirement benefit of the pensioners, but none of that gets invested in the communities where those pensioners live. So they are saving their money, and this money, instead of being invested in their communities, it's going to be invested in China. What you have is the slow death of that community, and that's happening across not just the United States, but other communities around the world, where China does a good job of bringing that capital in, typically through Hong Kong, into China, and once that gets converted into assets in China, they own it. And your ability to get that out is almost impossible. And so same for technology. They bring technology in, they bring talent in, they pay this 1,000 Talents program. And so in doing that, you're basically, even if they have, which they do, 75% of the economy is run by state-owned enterprises, and the state-owned enterprises are very efficient, up to 25% less efficient than a private company. But they have all this technology, talent, and capital. It kind of papers over those inefficiencies. So what's happening is you're creating this hyper inefficient global economy that is slowly bleeding the democracies dry, because the companies that exist and the people, the citizens that exist in those democracies, cannot compete with China, China Inc., for those resources of capital, talent, and technology. And that's what you see in the AI industry. That's what you're seeing in the quantum industry. All of the stuff is starting to pour into China, and it's a positive reinforcement loop. In other words, the more you get, the better you get, and the harder it is to compete. And that's exactly what's going on.
Before I bring in some of the audience here, I want to get your thoughts on this line that's out there that we're in a deglobalization phase, right? That the pendulum is starting to swing back towards having more things within our borders. How are you seeing China respond to that if that's sort of a longer term theme? I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. Obviously, you still have labor arbitrage opportunities in terms of hiring outside of the U.S. But what do you suspect the CCP's response is ultimately going to be to sort of a broader trend towards deglobalization?
Well, I think, first of all, when the Trump administration negotiated the trade deal, it was 150 pages. And, Liu He took that back to Zhongnanhai, and then Xi Jinping tore up about 50 pages of it and came back. And they really didn't have a trade deal. At that point, I realized that, rather than say, hey, we are decoupling from China, China is decoupling from us. And so what they are doing is they are in the process of accumulating as much of this technology, talent, and capital as they can, and investing it in their partners, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and the countries of the Belt and Road Initiative, to ensure they have an economic ecosystem that is self-reinforcing to China. Now, you can see basically the beginnings of what is going to happen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Essentially, we're going to try to cut off the Chinese in the same way that we've done Russia. The problem is, in April, they call in, the world's bankers and said, okay, we're going to get these sanctions levied on us when we invade Taiwan. What do we do? And so they've already prepped for that. One of the problems is, if you go back to the first Cold War, we own the supply chain. Today, they own the supply chain. So if we go and say, hey, you've invaded Taiwan, we're going to put financial sanctions on you, like we've done with Russia. Oh, by the way, it creates supply shortages, it spikes prices, which means we got inflation. The Fed reacts to slow down the economy because we have inflation. Oh, by the way, the reason we have inflation is because of the supply chain, not because of the money supply. It slows down your economy, so you get something very much like we had in the 70s called stagflation. Well, it's going to be even worse with China because they're just going to say, okay, you want to play that game, we're just going to cut off your pharmaceuticals. Over 90% of our pharmaceuticals come from China, almost 100% of our antibiotics. So all of a sudden, what are you going to do when your medicines are cut off? What are you going to do when rare earth metals, which are used to make microelectronics, are cut off? There's nothing you can do. And so if we don't reshore manufacturing or friendshore, i.e., let's bring it into North America and South America, let's build the economies of the Americas to support, that's what's going to happen. We are going to be cut off from the things that we need. And it doesn't matter at that point how many dollars we have, because if you don't have the ability to build something, you're not, the price of it is going to be whatever whoever has it is going to make you pay. So that's the challenge we face with globalization, and why, we should have, right now it's too late. We face this problem today. Right now, we're staring down the barrel of a gun. And I don't think Washington, D.C. understands how precarious our situation is, because we've had so much good years from, the end of the Cold War, and we own the supply chain. We have never been in a situation where we don't own the supply chain. We're reliant on somebody else, and we don't have a means in place to fix it.
But hold on. But let's talk about it, because that's an interesting point that you bring up, Josh, for General Spalding, which is that how do you actually get encouragement for that to come to the U.S.? Because again, it goes back to
let's just be clear: you can't encourage that.
Right.
It has to be by government decree.
Correct.
Because China, if you try to encourage that, China will crush. Again, we're talking about China Inc. against a company. So say somebody wants to say, hey, I want to manufacture pharmaceuticals. China will do everything they can to destroy that company. So this has to be by decree. In other words, the government has to say, we will bring back manufacturing, which means that we will not sell another Chinese product in this industry in this country. That is what we're talking about here. If that doesn't happen, forget about it. We're not going to do it. And this is where I say the way that you do war has changed fundamentally. And if we don't recognize that, then we are going to continue to lose. Yeah, so let me tackle the first. I mean, those are very, very good questions. Let me tackle the first one. Have you read a book called The Politics Industry? It's a really good book written by a woman named Catherine Gale and a Harvard professor named Michael Powell. In the book, let's just talk about Catherine Gale. Catherine Gale was a CEO of a family-owned food company in Wisconsin. She's doing and Michael Powell does business strategy. So they're doing a whiteboard session for her company, and she had been active in politics, donating to politicians, and but frustrated because she never gets any results. And they were talking about her industry that she was in, the food industry, and they were talking about the market dynamics. And then she had an epiphany, and that epiphany was that the politics industry is much like any industry. And what had happened, and what she recognized, is that the incentives were misaligned. In other words, in any industry, particularly that one where you don't have a monopoly, then the customers kind of dictate how companies behave. In other words, if you make a bad product, people say, I'm not going to buy that product. And so companies are incentivized to give them a good product at a good price. Well, in the case of the politics, what she recognized were that the politicians were incentivized not to provide for the citizens. They were actually incentivized to provide for themselves. And so what had grown up in our system was this duopoly, where the parties essentially competed, but not really. In other words, what they competed for control, but in essence, they were competing against each other in a system where the citizen was left out. How does that work? Well, somebody gets elected with 33% of the vote because they appeal to their base, and in that district, it is all one party. And so what was happening in this duopoly was that we were not getting the kind of results that our democracy is supposed to give you to deal with the social disruption that we were talking about. So people were upset; they lost their jobs, they lost a factory in the hometown. But when they went to their politicians, they were actually when the politicians are raising money, who they're raising from are the people that are benefiting from the system as it is. And so, for example, corporations who are highly incentivized to cooperate with China in these ways are not allowing a lot of the policies that would go to alleviating the problem in our system. So the way policy gets made in Washington, D.C. is that somebody will come in with a great idea on how to fix a problem, and then pretty soon you'll have corporate lobbyists coming in and going to those members and saying, we need to change this language here. We need to change that language there. I see this all the time, and I saw it when I was at the White House. And so what happens is that what I would say unvirtuous cycle of a duopoly then ensures that the politicians gain and the political parties gain in terms of donations, but the citizens don't gain in terms of policies. And so the citizens actually can do something about this. And in that politics industry book, Catherine Gale talks about how we should change our voting system to one of more open primaries and one where you have essentially a final five voting process. And that really means that by the time somebody is elected to that seat or that position, they have garnered over 50% of the votes because they've had to reach across the aisle. Nobody that just stays with one party can get elected. So those systems are starting to get actually voted into place. In the 2020 election, Alaska was made a open primary and final five voting systems. That process is starting to build. So democracy, can't heal itself if we can't get citizens' needs taken care of by the politicians. So that's one of the things that the Chinese have benefited from in terms of how our political system has evolved. It has nothing to do with our constitution. It just has to do with the mechanics of how politics gets done. And I apologize. That's the answer to the first question. The second question again. Yeah, it's parasitic, right? It will destroy the host. But the Chinese Communist Party, they have only one goal. It's in their constitution, and that is to stay in power. And so, in the end, so think of it like this: if China kills the host, who is the most powerful when that happens? China. If China kills the host and China is the most powerful at that time, then everybody recognizes that they have the best system. So the Chinese Communist Party comes out on top, even though they have won with a less efficient system. And because of our openness of our societies, and again, because I just explained, we've got at this point a fractured political system, they can take advantage of that. So yeah, they'll kill the host, but at the end of the day, when you look at it from the Chinese Communist Party's eyes, it's a zero-sum game. As long as I'm more powerful than the host, then I still am in charge, which is their ultimate goal, to remain in charge. So first of all, as a voter, you can know the issues, you know what we're talking, know the problems that we're talking about, and you can go and talk to your representatives. You can find out which one actually understands those things. The other thing is there are grassroots efforts going on around the country to change the way our voting system works. And those are all state level systems. And so it starts at the grassroots. You start recognizing the problems, and then you start organizing to go after the problems. Now, that is what Americans can do, because it's a free country. You can start in your local area to begin organizing, and you can, with your own vote, begin to push this in the right direction. Our system is a bottom-up system, and if our citizens aren't educated and engaged and doing the things that we need to do, there's no agency that's going to fix this, because all agencies are kind of captured by corporate and financial institution influence. They can't get out of that death spiral. This has to come from the grassroots, and it has to come first. Again, we're a federated republic, right? We're a federal republic where the states have powers. Any power that wasn't granted to the federal government, which is primarily for making money and protecting, the common defense, any power that's not vested in them is vested in the state, in our system. And that means that states need to start really taking back control of our system, and primarily states' own voting system, the way we vote. That happens at the state level. And then we start to get people coming at the federal level that have been elected to work across the aisle, to partner with the other party, to get solutions done. I believe our system will start to correct itself.
I think the problem, real quick on that, is that, and I'm very cynical about people's attention spans, is that people would rather tweet, retweet, and their displeasure or frustrations rather than actually pick up the phone, right, and actually call a representative or send an email, whatever it is, right? So there does become this dilemma where people think they're taking action because they're noting things or complaining about things on social media, but they're not actually taking the next step.
Well, I mean, the majority of people didn't fight for our independence, right? A minority. They got up and they said, we're fed up and we're going to do something about it. That's what I'm saying. You don't do something about it by, just protesting. What you do is you change things at the local level in terms of the voting process and how we get people. So we have to take back the political system in a way that says, if you're elected by the people of your district or your state or the federal government, that you are responsive to those people. And I think the only, quite frankly, election system that I think kind of still does this is the election for the president. It's the only one that really, because of the Electoral College, has a little bit. But even that, I'm starting to lose faith in. So I really think that if we as citizens don't step up, and it doesn't have to be everybody, it doesn't have to be a majority of the citizens, because that's not how we gained our independence. It has to be only a minority, and that minority has to do something about this. I would think of it like this: you ever watch the movie where the guy is slowly getting poisoned? The doctor is slowly poisoning him. He says he's curing him, but he's giving him a little drink of medicine, and it's actually poison. So he's slowly dying. So
that sounds like quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve. But
this is what it is. I mean, the Chinese don't have a time horizon. The only time horizon they have right now, and I think it's going to probably be the thing that saves us, because we're going to wake up to what the Chinese Communist Party really is Taiwan. I think in terms of what they're willing to do, absent a Taiwan, I think they'll just continue to poison us slowly until we're dead. That's the problem, right? We tend to think in terms of national security as somebody punching in the mouth. You got to go do something about it today. No, China's not punching you in the mouth. They're basically putting a little bit of poison in your food every single day.
Let's go to Nasik and then Dylan, and then I want to touch on the new book also, General, because I want to give you a chance to kind of plug that too. Right. So how would you respond to that, General Spalding? It's an interesting point because I think that's, again, goes back to kind of, divisiveness and incentives to try to make it so that we're not so reliant on China for all these things that they are, you can maybe argue, are manipulating.
Absolutely correct. 100%.
That was that's very good, terse.
No, I mean, this is so basically before the Trump administration, and I'd worked very closely with the Obama administration. I'd been in office Secretary of Defense, I think, during the Bush administration. So, obviously, I'd been through many administrations in my almost 30-year career in the Air Force. And what you find is that it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican administration; they all pretty much do the same things. And so, DOJ is not chicken shit in this case. DOJ is doing what it's told. And so before, I would say roughly 2018, DOJ and FBI were told, you will not do anything against any foreign agent, Chinese foreign agent in this country, period. In fact, they had, this had happened with regard to, what's his name? Gol Wengui, the billionaire that was holed up in the Sherry Netherland in New York City. They had sent, MSS, Ministry of State Security officers to New York to rendition him. They couldn't. And the FBI caught them at the airport. And the FBI was told by the State Department, you will release them and not do anything. And so I'll just give you one other example. When I started looking into this, I went to the Commerce Department, BIS, that does enforcement for things like the entity list. And I asked a BIS officer, okay, if I have a country like Sri Lanka and they're doing something that is a national security issue, what do I need to do? What's the process for me getting a Sri Lankan company put on the entity list? And he said, just send us an email. Just tell us, okay? That's all you need. You don't need any evidentiary stuff. The DOD can tell Commerce, we need to put this company on the entity list because it's a national security threat. And I said, okay, well, what happens if it's a Chinese company? Oh, no, that goes to the president. And so what I saw is that we basically, anything to do with China, we refuse to allow any agency to do anything whatsoever that would anger the Chinese Communist Party, period.
Yeah, I really want to do at some point a space with you, General Spalding, which would include Kyle Bass, who I've had on a couple of these conversations before, and Chris Fenton, because I feel like the three of you would have a field day talking about a lot of this stuff. Before I get to the rest of the audience,
by the way, I took Kyle into the Treasury when I was at the White House, and we said, take the assets that companies in the U.S. are reporting on their financial reports in China and make them level 3 assets, make them the equivalent of worthless because they cannot take that money out. And Treasury failed to do it. Why? Because Wall Street dictates what the Treasury Department does. Corporate America dictates what the Commerce Department does.
Yeah, no, agreed. And let me just reset real quick for everybody here. Please make sure you follow General Spalding. As you can tell, very knowledgeable, and obviously we're all thankful for the service that he's done for this country. General Spalding, for those that want to maybe get a little bit more in depth, you've got 2 books, Stealth War, and then the new book, War Without Rules. I want to focus a little bit on the new book, War Without Rules, China's Playbook for Global Domination. How does that differ from Stealth War? Are there any sort of new observations or things that have happened post-COVID as you started putting that book together? Talk through that a little bit here.
Well, so, I mean, Stealth War was kind of my words about what I had learned during my time in government about the U.S.-China relationship and the implications of it from a national security perspective. War Without Rules actually was a condensed version of a document written by 2 People's Liberation Army Air Force lieutenant colonels in 1999 that was, translated by the open source center of the CIA and available for anybody in 1999. I read it. At the time, it was very difficult to understand. Certainly didn't get what they were trying to say. But as I was going back and I was in the Pentagon supporting the chairman, I reread it. I understood, that it was very, very distinctly what I would call a doctrine document. Now, doctrine is what strategists and military officers use to plan wars. It is a set of principles that you develop over many years or decades of war fighting to say, hey, what are the principles that we should look to be successful in future wars? And so what they were laying out was a different kind of doctrine than I had ever experienced. And so when you go and kind of break that down, what they are saying is globalization in the internet. And remember that the People's Liberation Army is a armed political component of the Chinese Communist Party. And China and the Chinese Communist Party wage predominantly something called political warfare, not war. So Clausewitz, who's a famous Prussian general who wrote, a big treatise on war, has famously said, war is politics by other means. In other words, when you can't achieve something using geopolitics or foreign policy or economic sanctions or whatever, you go to war to achieve that. So you're achieving a political objective using force. What Mao believed is that you could use politics to actually be successful in war. And so, and this, by the way, mimics a lot of ancient Chinese writings and things like Sun Tzu. The acme of a general is to win without fighting. And so, what these two PLA Air Force colonels recognized was that globalization in the internet enabled a globalization of political warfare on a level never before attained. And so what I try to do in War Without Rules is unrestricted warfare is really hard to read. So I broke it out, I condensed it, and I tried to give my explanations of each of the sections about how this doctrine had been embraced by the Chinese Communist Party. One of the criticisms for unrestricted warfare is that people say, well, it's not a strategy. And that's right. It is not a strategy. It is a doctrine document. And in fact, they say themselves, we are laying out the principles of war, of a new kind of war, a war that doesn't use weapons, a war that uses economics and finance and trade and politics and the media and academics, and uses all these elements that are everyday to our lives and begins to break them down and show how you can take those elements of things in a globalized, internet-connected world and use them to undermine the faith and confidence of a people in their institutions. That's what. So War Without Rules is basically designed to show Americans China's doctrine for war. It was basically to create a free trade zone in the Pacific, and essentially, when you have the second biggest economy or the biggest economy, depending on if you're looking at purchasing power parity or not, who doesn't actually believe in free trade, and you try to create a free trade regime where they're not specifically isolated from interacting with the members of that trade regime, then it's bound to fail. It's not really about free trade; it's about biased trade. And I think what had happened was that both the TPP was dead on arrival in the United States, but in any account, it would not have been in America's interest to be in the TPP because all of the nations of the TPP were fighting to maintain their trade relationship with China, which essentially China uses either directly, they have a biased trade relationship with the United States, or uses their third-party relationships to, for example, transship steel. So when we try to put tariffs on Chinese steel, they ship it through Vietnam and have it, stamp it made in Vietnam, and so they bypass the tariff. So anytime we have a partner who doesn't also specifically, prevent the Chinese from using them as a proxy to attack the U.S., you're bound to fail. And so I think that's where I think TPP really was never going to work. No, that's the purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative. So they've already established a claim on the resources they need outside of the United States, whether that be the countries of Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, all the way into Eastern Europe. So Russia, they've established claims, and that's what they've done. Over the last 20 years, they've basically locked down those resources for things like from countries like that are in Africa. So they have all the access to all the resources that they need. They've created those relationships and those claims on those resources over the last 20, 30 years. And what you're finding is predominantly the only ones that are, honoring the Russian sanctions are the countries of the West. Pretty much the developing nations aren't playing along, and anybody that really has a strong relationship with China and wants to continue that is not playing along. Well, again, if China's having a better model for their citizens, and that model is to use the technology, talent, and capital from the West to achieve that, then that's where we get into the inspiration. People are actually inspired by the China model, and so where does that where is that leading? I think Washington D.C., at least from a national security and foreign policy perspective, recognizes the problem now. The problem is corporate America and financial institutions are still pushing policies that support their businesses. And we haven't figured out in America yet that we actually have to specifically preclude these relationships using government mandate. Otherwise, these businesses, these corporations, these financial institutions will not stop their behavior.
Again, thank you for your service. Thank you for joining. Hopefully you found some value from this, and I will do another space tomorrow morning, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, General Spalding.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.